everyone. Welcome to our EV charging roundtable. It's really great to see you all. I'm going to go ahead and get us started now. This is session 4 of our Michigan EV Charging Roundtable series, and our topic today is rural charging. I'm really excited for the conversation. I think we're going to get into some of the real opportunities and nuance of putting EV charging stations in rural communities in Michigan. I'm going to give just kind of an overview of what these sessions are all about, and then I'm going to hand it over to some excellent speakers that we have lined up for you today. My name is Jane McCurry. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Fuels Michigan. We are a nonprofit trade association that's focused on advancing the transition to clean mobility in Michigan. I want to give a shout out and special thanks to all of our members that make this work possible. Thank you if you are a member of Clean Fuels Michigan. If you're not yet a member and you're interested, please reach out to me or Jessica on my team who's here on the call, and we can share that information with you. So to give a little bit of background on the opportunity in EV charging and why we're hosting a series of roundtables focused on EV charging right now, Michigan's My Healthy Climate Plan and the Council on Future Mobility and Electrification have set goals to prepare the infrastructure in Michigan to support 2 million electric vehicles by the year 2030. That's not that far away, and that's a lot of vehicles and a lot of infrastructure that's needed. The great news is that Michigan is set to receive $110 million over the next 5 years to invest in EV charging infrastructure from the bipartisan infrastructure law. That means we have $16 million. It's going to flow into the state within the next few months to really kickstart the EV charging infrastructure network throughout the state and build on all of the great work that's already happening in Michigan. So there's a huge opportunity to do this the right way to support electric vehicle adoption in a really exciting and I think new way. There are hundreds of miles of alternative fuel corridors in rural areas in Michigan that, based on this NEVI plan, are going to need charging stations every 50 miles. So I know this map is kind of small on here, but if you see those blue and green lines, that's all the roadways in Michigan that the state is tasked with putting fast, high power charging stations every 50 miles. And many of those are going to be in more rural communities that don't yet have charging infrastructure. So a huge opportunity to make sure that Michiganders and visitors to Michigan can get anywhere that they want or need to go in the state confidently in an electric vehicle. But it also presents many challenges for putting new infrastructure in new places across the state. EV charging infrastructure, as you all know, is really complicated. You have numerous stakeholders, including technology providers, fleets, different funding opportunities, electrical infrastructure. You have the utilities involved, federal and state programs that all need to come together to form a successful project. And so this roundtable series is an opportunity to create a forum to tackle those complicated topics head on together. We hope that this forum can help us curate our collective recommendations for Michigan's EV charging programs and also highlight Michigan stakeholders' leadership in all of the really great work that's already going on in the state. So with that said, we have 3 amazing presenters teed up for today. We have John Kopinski from ITC, Kitty Adams from Adapt-A-Charger, and Mayor Jim Gardner from Luna Pier. We'll have plenty of time for open discussion. So I encourage you all, introduce yourself in the chat, drop your email, drop your LinkedIn, put your questions in the chat or jot them down so you can come off of mute when we get to that discussion portion and tell us your thoughts, ask your questions, provide your perspective. It's really meant to be a roundtable. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to John Kopinski, our first presenter, to tell us more about ITC's perspective for rural EV charging in Michigan.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Clean Fuels Michigan, for having me as a participant in this dialogue. I'm really excited to be part of it, and you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So a little bit first about ITC. Some of you are probably very familiar with who we are. For those that are not, here's just a little bit of information about us. We have a pretty large service territory inside 7 states that are primarily in the Midwest and the Great Plains area. A lot of lower Michigan is inside of our footprint, as you can see in that map in the center there. And we have thousands of miles of transmission lines that crisscross both Michigan and other places inside the Midwest. So certainly a pretty large presence as you see things here. Go ahead and move to the next slide. There are three parts to or actually before I get there, we have two main companies that ITC has in Michigan. ITC Transmission, a lot of you might recognize that as pretty closely related to the Detroit Edison native footprint. And then we have Michigan Electric Transmission Company, or METC, which looks pretty similar to the consumer's footprint. And that's because those are the companies that we were basically spun off of when the transmission assets were separated from the rest of the company. So yeah, quite a large space inside Michigan. Relevant to this topic, a lot of rural areas in which we have a lot of facilities. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So key as part of this electrification transition that we're all experiencing right now and really excited for is the three parts of the existing power grid as it exists today. And there's generation, which is power plants, and those might be renewable plants and other sources. We're seeing a lot of new solar facilities and wind facilities that are resulting in a lot fewer emissions on the grid. And then transmission is needed to get those pools of resources delivered to where the loads are for the distribution. So one of the things that is really key in this electrification is noting that it's not just the connection to the EV that's important, it's all of these different pieces of the system that really need to work in harmony together like three legs on a stool in order to be able to allow for this transition to take place. And ITC, our business is strictly inside the transmission space. So we don't generate any power. We don't serve any load directly as a distribution entity. We're just there to be able to move the power from a lot of these large bulk generation resources to the distribution entities where they can ultimately be connected. You can go ahead and move on. So what are some barriers or benefits or other things that are really important as we think about EV charging? These were a couple that came to mind for us as we contemplated that question. One of the things that really jumps out first is that rural America risks being left behind. So EV charging infrastructure and adoption is really highly concentrated in urban areas at present. And it's about 40% lower of EV adoption in rural America than it is in some of the urban and suburban areas. And this, unfortunately, is a consistent trend that has existed for rural areas that have tougher time getting access to infrastructure. And we can think historically about electricity when that was first being rolled out, largely solved by a lot of co-ops and other things like that. Internet, phone, et cetera. A lot of these are critical services that are really necessary for all of us. And it's something that rural infrastructure has just had a tougher time achieving. So it's not too surprising that we're seeing some of these same challenges here. One of the biggest ones that was kind of noted on the front end is there's a lot of charging deserts that exist where there could be a lot of challenges in being able to find the right places to plug in as you travel. Another one is high upfront vehicle costs. I think a lot of us are familiar with that. A lower total cost of ownership is an important aspect, which is a positive, a benefit that could exist, especially as we look at rural America that tends to drive more, spends more on gasoline and motor oil. So a lot of these costs that you might see for vehicles, that could be diminished as we transition over to electric vehicles. And then another one that I think all of us have spent some time looking at is what's the right EV model. Previously, there were not very many models to choose from, and now there's a lot more models. And I think a lot of them, we're starting to see ones that might be a lot more applicable for those in rural America, in particular, like the truck offerings and other things like that really provide for a lot of both on-road as well as off-road applications. And then lastly, as we think about barriers and benefits, we've got a really important question of, will there just be prohibitive, costly upgrades to a lot of these systems in order to be able to turn them into capable of supplying EV needs? Or will this be an opportunity for broader infrastructure access? And certainly there will be costs as we look at this, but I think we need to also think about the benefits that would be associated with having broader infrastructure. So let's turn to some of the solutions, at least as we're thinking about. So some of the needed solutions that we have, tax credits and EV incentives, really to lower these adoption costs. I think all of us know that one of the most affordable vehicles you can have is the one that's actually sitting in your driveway, because that's really just an easy vehicle to be able to have. But as we get to this transition, we're going to have to lower the cost, especially for the adoption through plans that are inside Build Back Better or the IRA. There's a lot of federal funding that does help to address that. And there's also other opportunities inside some existing agricultural department resources that could be tapped into. And really the purpose of those is to make sure that we have equitable federal funding and planning for charging infrastructure. And this really must include rural communities as we think about it. Some of the solutions that rural America is particularly able to adopt is that there is a lot of accessible sites. Oftentimes the highway corridors have less congestion around them. There's a lot of access to convenience stores and other things like that. So as we think about, where might these sites for rural charging exist, I think we do have quite a bit of the map to be able to deal with, but it certainly is a challenge as we think about that. You can go and move to the next slide. And to kind of round out some of the other needed solutions that we have, this is really a huge one of interconnecting to the existing electric infrastructure. So there is a massive build out that occurred, over the last century of the electricity system. And that is a great resource for us to be able to tap into. Much of what we can do and much of what we need to do will be utilizing the assets that were put in the ground 20, 30, even 40 years ago. Some of those which will need to be upgraded, but many have long serviceable life that's still left. And so there are really many opportunities for high quality, high demand public charging depots as we look across the regions in particular in Michigan. And so there's a potential for better or faster access locations in rural regions where there's fewer encumbrances that might exist around highly developed areas that are just harder to be able to install and interconnect. Next is the utility infrastructure really needs to be matched to the charging needs. And this might mean that for certain locations where there's a large charging depot, that might be better suited for connecting to, say, a transmission line. There really are a lot of spaces where that could make sense. And then there also is the need to potentially build out new infrastructure to facilitate the EV adoption. So that could be enhancements to some of the existing infrastructure or new lines and new transformers that really allow for the interconnection of these charging facilities to the rest of the grid and to be able to access a lot of these bulk resources like solar and wind that allow for a lot of great charging needs at lower costs. And then lastly on here, the utility solutions are needed. There's really a lot of work that utility companies are going to have to do and really should be part of the solution. That's one of the reasons why ITC is stepping into this as well, is that we know that there's a lot of investment that's going to be required, a lot of good thinking and planning to really make sure that this gets set up appropriately. And one of the things that will be essential to ensure that we have good EV adoption is really getting the electric bill structure right. Including demand charges and time of use, because a lot of how electric bills were established were not based on the idea that you might plug in something that has a larger load than, say, the rest of your house or your barn or other things like that, that might have a different charging cycle or different usage pattern. So those are really important questions and not ones that we necessarily have answers to, but certainly important questions. You can go and move to the next slide. So I touched on this briefly. Really, what is ITC going to offer? We offer value-based transmission solutions. So where bulk resources need to be connected, where there are new communities that need to be connected, this is really the area that ITC has some strengths that can lend a lot of benefits, especially as we look at rural America becoming more electrified. So ensuring that charging infrastructure is available to support the consumer adoption. And as the EV market continues to grow, making sure that we have the upgrades so that the grid can continue to handle a lot of these higher capacity, faster charging facilities that will get us a lot closer to a dwell time similar to what refueling your internal combustion engine might look like. So we definitely look forward to being part of the conversation, and thanks again. We look forward to your questions. Jane, I believe we're taking questions at the end, right?
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I think we'll roll through the presentations and then we can open it up to discussion.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Yeah, but everyone keep your questions, keep your points in mind. We'll have plenty of time to discuss. Thanks so much, John. Up next, we have Kitty Adams from Adopt a Charter. So Kitty, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Jane. For some reason, I'm feeling kind of nervous, even though I have a lot of friends on the call. So if I talk too fast or skip something, please follow up with me in the questions. So my contact information, and next slide. These are some of the sponsors and partners that Adopt a Charter has worked with over the last 12 years. And I think it's just important to point out that it's a spectrum of different sponsors. We've worked with utilities, automakers, state parks, national parks, pretty much just anybody that is willing to step up and try to fill the void. Next slide. Adopt a Charter was started as a nonprofit. So back in 2009, when the American Recovery and Reinvestment money was being distributed, I saw a lot of charging stations being crowded into commercial zones. And, hey, it's great that there's a charging station at the drugstore by my house, but it's 1.5 miles away. And I do 90% of my charging at home. As a longtime EV driver, where I wanted to see EV charging stations were places like state parks, national parks, museums, universities, places where people routinely drive 30 to 40 miles to get there. So I want to enable the zero emission trip. Also, people are staying there. These are long dwell time locations where people can add a legitimate amount of range at a level 2 charging station. And for selfish reasons, I wanted to charge at Leo Creo State Beach and the Getty Center. So next slide, please. So I was asked, and I'm very proud to present the partnership that Adopt a Charter has with the DNR. It started 8 years ago with Bay City State Park, and things have recently gotten really real with the help from Rivian. Rivian has sponsored the phase 1 of the charging, as has ITC. ITC is providing the funding for the electricity. So for the initial phase, these charging stations will be offered fee-free to the EV driving community. And we're going to approach this in phases. So phase 1 is primarily working up the western side of the state to get people up, the Lake Michigan, and to enable EV tourism on the west side of the state. But we are looking at, going up I-75, the east side of the state. We've already been doing some site visits up in the UP. So nobody will get left behind. But really the intention is to enable that EV tourism, encourage people to leave their gas guzzler at home. And it's interesting because I've been doing a lot of outreach events since 2010, and more than range anxiety, what I hear from people is lack of appropriate body style. So now we have the pickup trucks coming. We've got a 7-seater SUV. So there's no longer that excuse. The other thing I heard is people wanted to charge at places they wanted to go. I want to charge my car at Yosemite. So I think that we're starting to address some of the concerns that the general public had about getting an EV. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges. So I was really asked to address some of the reasons why it hasn't been working in rural areas. And I'm highlighting an article that was published last year by Clean Technica, where they tried to do an EV road trip. And, it's easier to make things happen in Santa Monica or San Francisco, or even in Detroit, metropolitan areas where the charging stations are highly utilized. But in rural areas, it's difficult to commercialize the product. And some of the challenges here I've listed is, there's sporadic use. A lot of the state parks are seasonal. They're not being used 7 days a week. So if you're having to pay networking fees based on, that asset, only being used maybe 20% of the time, it's really difficult to make a business case or get cost recovery. And also, the stations in this is the one from Petrified Forest, they're often fall into disrepair. And then there's a lot of finger pointing about whose responsibility it is to repair the charging stations. One of the reasons I felt really good about bringing in Rivian as a sponsor for the Michigan DNR sites is they're also offering to operate and maintain the EV charging stations. So, oftentimes they're constantly running diagnosis on these charging stations. This example I'm showing here is a third-party provider that sold the equipment, but then, when the initial term was over, then what happens? So the other challenge is these are oftentimes in remote areas where there's not a lot of eyeballs on the asset. So if the charging station is not getting used on a regular basis, that just opens up opportunity for vandalism and theft. Luckily, knock on wood, I haven't had any problems with adopted charger locations, typically because there's high utilization. We're offering a fee-free amenity, so people are oftentimes plugging in. And also they feel ownership of the asset. Who doesn't feel like the state parks belong to them? So we're setting up like just a different customer experience. Another challenge is the network connectivity in rural areas. I know a lot of you probably understand this from your cell phone, and there's two sides to that. So even if the charging station is able to ping onto a network, we also have the challenge of the EV driver being able to download the app, upload their credit card, and it could be that the charging station is working absolutely fine on the AT&T network, but if a driver comes in and they have Verizon or T-Mobile, there might not be service for them to be able to access the charging station. I know that the solutions are being developed, but I don't want to wait to put charging stations in until we've actually perfected everything. So what we're doing currently with the charging stations at Holland State Park, thanks again to ITC, is we're offering it fee-free to the EV drivers for the initial term. So they don't have to come in and download a credit card. We don't have to authenticate payment. So really, again, bringing it back to reliability is the priority. And the other thing, we talked about charging deserts. John mentioned that. There oftentimes is no plan B here. If you're in a downtown area, you can just go to maybe the commercial trading zone across the street and charge at the mall. But when you're in the UP at an EV charger, and if for some reason it's not working, where do you go? So we want to be able to give people the confidence to take their EVs to these locations. Next slide, please. So yeah, the bottom line and what that article pointed out is that the level 2 charging should be convenient, free, and reliable. We just recently did an analysis with the National Park Service about charging because they've had a lot of challenges along the way. And they actually decided they want to stick with the philanthropy model and continue to work with Adopt a Charger to find sponsors. And just to give you an idea, I kind of liken Adopt a Charger to NPR or PBS, where I get foundational funding to install the EV charging stations, and then I rely on sponsorship and user support to continue to operate those charging stations. A few of these projects I wanted to highlight. Stinson Beach is also one that was sponsored by Rivian, and here, even though it's close to San Francisco, we don't have a very strong cell signal. So we do get a ping, so we can definitely make sure those charging stations are operational and monitor the utilization, but there's not a strong enough signal there for the EV driver, again, to upload their credit card and authenticate the payment. In the bottom quarter, Catoctin Mountain Park in Maryland, this was a situation where the National Park Service had a contract with a network provider to offer the charging stations. And what ended up happening is the National Park Service was paying more in fees than they were recouping in driver payments. So they turned off the charging stations. So they reached out to me and said, hey, can you bail us out? And it was simply me getting a family foundation to write a check to the National Park Service to make these charging stations free. So that's oftentimes the dilemma in rural areas is you're paying more in fees than you are recouping in revenue, and nobody wants to lose money on this. I'm also showing you Fort Ross State Historic Park in Sonoma County, California. There's no cell phone signal there. So until we can perfect either near field communication or other, maybe it's through the Starlink network, but currently the only option for providing EV charging there was to do it fee-free. And the driver just pulls up and plugs in and they get the charge. One thing I like to point out about Fort Ross is once we put these charging stations in, I kind of think of it as like the Johnny Appleseed approach. I put these charging stations in, and then all of a sudden, charging stations started sprouting out in the Gateway community. Once people saw the EVs coming into their area, the hotel properties, the restaurants, different Gateway community businesses decided to install EV charging. Next slide, please. So another huge challenge is lack of power and environmental obstacles, whether it's tree roots or artifacts, or we can't have a ground disturbance because it maybe is a Native American site. And for this particular project, I'm working with the Sonoma County Regional Parks for some remote beach locations where we have all of the challenges. We have cell phone issues, we have sensitive environmental areas. We also need grid resiliency. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar, but there have been a lot of fires up in Sonoma County. There's rolling blackouts in that area oftentimes. So they wanted a solution where they could operate off grid if necessary. So in the past, I've used the Envision Solar Arc system at a California state park, a few California state parks, and that worked pretty good. But I'm presenting the Yoda Energy Rev system, which is actually they're having their big launch tomorrow. So you're kind of getting a preview of that solution. And what they do is they take a structure similar to a storage container, and they house the batteries in that container. They have the solar panels, which power the batteries, and then that we can deliver power through the EV chargers to the cars. What's important for Sonoma County is they can also use this asset for grid resiliency. If the grid goes down, they actually can't flush the toilets at this park. So it's really, really important that we have some type of backup power. So in addition to charging cars, this is also giving us the ability to have that grid resiliency. And I think that might be it. Oh, one more. Oh my gosh. And this is very, very important. ADA accessibility. This is a challenge everywhere, but especially in rural areas. And for the DNR, they have, I can't remember the exact name of the program, but they're really trying to make all the state parks accessible to everybody. They're offering adaptive programs for fishing, kayaking, boating, hunting. So we want to be able to get people to these parks. On the bottom left is my nephew, John. And here he is at Petoskey State Park. He also goes to Young State Park. It's personal for me. I want to make sure that, people like John can have the same access to opportunities as I do. So I just wanted to show you how we're addressing that in the install. I'm showing you a picture of Holland State Beach, where if you can see that green striped area is the accessible path of travel. You can see that a little bit clearer in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area example. So what we're doing is we're enabling somebody that comes with an ADA van to park next to the charging station, be able to lower the ramp and get out and have that space between the cars to access the EV charging station. And I think everybody here knows that sometimes parking spots are pretty compact and tightly next to each other. So this way we ensure that there's adequate space between the cars so that somebody can get out and plug in their car without any problems. So I think that is it. And I look forward to the questions so I can tell you more about these great projects.
Thank you so much, Kitty. That was so informative. I really appreciate it. And I'm also excited to hear what questions folks have for you. But first, we have one more speaker. I'm really excited that Mayor Jim Gardner of Luna Pier is here to talk to us about how he sees this benefiting his community and his perspective on EV charging. So Mayor Gardner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jane. What a great lead in from John and Kitty to my presentation. Luna Pier, we'll start with the geography. I am really excited about electric vehicle charging and charging stations. Luna Pier is, well, right here in the state. We're exit 6 on I-75. So traveling north out of Ohio, we are the first developed exit as you get into Michigan. We're also very close to Lake Erie. Now, in getting into our history a little bit, keep in mind that 75 to 100,000 vehicles a day drive right past the Luna Pier. They know we have a water tower, but they don't know anything else about our city. Michigan State University and MI Energy did a study. This goes back to 2019, but they laid out the optimization of chargers, and there's Luna Pier, one of the larger red dots on their map, and it correlates to 30 chargers. Right now, we don't have any, and we need some. We are a prime location for chargers. If you go on to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of a history of Luna Pier. This is our cash cow for many years. You can see our cash cow isn't feeling so well. This provided a coal, this is Consumers Energy, J.R. Whitting coal-fired power plant. You know the rest of the story right there. It provided 65% of the tax revenue for our city right there. And if you look on to the next slide, our cash cow just kind of rolled over one day. That's all that's left, a pile of rubble and some smoke. We have to get serious about saving our city. Now, before you feel too sorry for us, if you go to the next slide, this is Luna Pier, 1/2 mile from I-75. And with the great lead in, if you have to stop and charge, isn't this a great place to do it? Now, we're in the position that we need to attract customers. Our cash cow now is really I-75, 75 to 100,000 people driving right past. If we can tap into just a fraction of that revenue, of that spending power of 75,000 people, we're going to be fine. We have some great amenities in town. We have a great beach. We have a pier that actually goes out onto Lake Erie. We have some great restaurants in town. If you need to stop, what a great place to stop and charge and take a little walk, go see the beach, go out on the pier, go fishing, stop in one of the restaurants and eat. It's really key to our economic development of our city. Now, my background, ironically, is with Ford Motor Company. Before 2018, I spent 27 years at Ford Motor Company, research and development of internal combustion engines. We did worldwide research and development, building, testing of internal combustion engines. I love internal combustion engines. I know them inside and out. I love the technology, the complexity, all of the systems, combustion chambers, turbochargers, cam drives, cam systems, everything about it. When I was there, I left in the end of 2018. I retired from there to become a mayor. I could see the writing on the wall. I could see where all the money from Ford Motor Company was going, and it was leaving internal combustion engines and going to EV development. They were advertising. Every email that the engineering group sent out had a plea on the bottom that if you're interested in joining the EV teams, there's jobs available. So I saw the money going right there, and they've doubled down since then. I really love how, knowing the gas engines inside and out, I love how the electric vehicles, when they say they're simpler, they're not kidding. That you have a rotor, you have a stator, you don't have any reciprocating mass like you do with an internal combustion engine. You have a carrier bearing set that carries a planetary gear set, which is very basic, and that electric motor, and that thing's going to run for a long time. It's not going to have the maintenance or the oil changes or anything you have to do with an electric vehicle. And I like my clean beach. I like my clean air. That's vital. Luna Pier has to be a great place to live. And it really is. It's safe, it's affordable, and it's just a beautiful place. And electric vehicles feed right into that, because living next to 75 to, I don't know how many cars go by there actually, but living next to that many cars going down right next to our community, air quality is an issue. And I am really looking forward to electric vehicles. It's vital to our economy. One of the big challenges we have, though, is trying to convince people that this thing is real. Now, I'm used to working in my career 2 to 4 years in advance. We built prototype engines that were 2 to 4 years out. I see the EV thing as like, I wish everybody would see what's happening here. And it's really exciting to be part of that. What I really like about my job at Ford is that the day I left there, I loved the job as much as when I walked in, because every day I'd come in and say, how are we going to change the world today? And we did. Walking in the shoes of some of the places where Henry Ford himself walked, we were changing the world. And everybody here, when you're a part of this, you are changing the world. This thing is really big. And for me, ironically, the biggest challenge is trying to convince people that, yes, this is really important. Even the businesses, they're slowly getting on board, but I'm explaining to them that this is a huge economic advantage. It's vital to our economic growth that people are going to look for a place to charge. The residents in town who do own electric vehicles, they are really excited. They get it. And they are really happy about our efforts to bring in chargers. Now, the best places in Luna Pier for chargers are commercially owned, privately owned lots. We have a gas station there that is already been approved for the consumer's energy funding. They're in the process of they'll have the first charger. There's a lot right across the street, right within the line of sight of the expressway exit. That is a prime location. And I would like to see those areas fill up first, rather than, I have no problem with putting them on city property, but they're a little bit out of the way, where the commercial locations right out front, it's a great boost to those businesses. And that's where we're going to see the most benefit. It's where people are going to see them and we're going to want to stop. It's easy to get to, and they're less than half a mile from Lake Erie when they do that. That's what I see as the challenges involved, is with our limited resources, trying to wade through some of the intricacies of the funding and how to get that funding in our city and apply for it and do all of the administrative work with very few people to do that work. So that's some of the challenges that we have in Luna Pier, but it's a great opportunity too. I'm really looking forward to really this revolution. I hear people say that I'm all for progress, but it's change I can't stand. And that's kind of what's working against us right now. But really, everybody on this call can rectify that, because it really is a big change, and it's going to be great. If you drive an electric vehicle, you'll know why it's going to be a big thing. That's about all I have with my presentation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. That was great. It's really exciting to hear that communities in Michigan are excited about this money, that they're excited about the opportunities that electrification can provide, especially when we think about economic development. I think you're right, it is super important. And to your point about, needing some support on the administrative side, needing some technical support, that's what this group is here to do. There are folks on this call today that can answer those questions or put you in touch with the right people. So I do hope that you'll lean on us to help make sure we get more charging stations in Luna Pier. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to all of our presenters. Now is the really fun part where we get to have more of an open discussion. I'm curious if anyone has any questions or wants to add anything to the discussion. I know I have quite a few, but I want to make sure that folks on the call have a chance. You can feel free to unmute. You can feel free to put your questions in the chat.
Jane, this is Kitty.
Yeah.
Can I add a couple things that I
Please.
realized I forgot to mention? You mentioned the economic development. This is really an important part of it, James, because there's been a study where for every dollar that's saved at the pump, it equates to $10 of local currency. So if we're not, buying gas and sending that money to the Middle East, all of a sudden people are saving money on their fueling costs, and the waitress has money to get her hair done, and then the hairdresser has more money to get her dry cleaning done. So it is really a good economic stimulator for communities. I also wanted to thank consumers. I'm so sorry, Carl, because they were integral to this DNR project and helped with some of the costly upgrades that we needed through Power My Drive. So I wanted to take the opportunity to thank them here. And also, I know Chuck Allen from the DNR is on the call too, because another very important part of what we're doing is we're greening the fleet. We're helping to enable the Michigan State Parks to add electric vehicles to their fleet because they'll have charging stations, unlike a typical fleet where they're maybe coming back, they're going to multiple locations. So if they can charge in Holland State Beach midday, that's going to enable them to take the electric truck over the gas truck. The other thing that's really, really important is why we're doing it. And a lot of, the National Parks has a program, it's called Climate Friendly Parks. And the California State Parks is called the Cool Parks Initiative, because what we realize is that in order for these locations to reduce their carbon footprint, 45% of it comes from the people driving their cars to the location. So by enabling the charging, we're reducing the overall carbon footprint for the parks.